Welcome to Dig Life Deep with John Aidan Byrne.
Dr. STEVEN PAYSON is an economist at the Department of Labour. He teaches at the University of Maryland, and he recently published his second volume on extreme poverty in the world. It's titled How the World Bank and United Nations Measures It. Fake Economics Exposed, Its Pervasiveness, Harmfulness and Prevention. And Dr. STEVEN PAYSON is my guest coming up.
I don't know what's in people's minds and in their hearts. I don't know what the agenda is. But all I can say is this is one example of how a lot of times, and people have talked about this, poverty is exaggerated for the sake of attracting support and donations. And well-known economists, you probably heard of him, William Easterly, has made a big argument against what's called poverty porn. The idea, of showing horrible pictures, people in malnourished areas, people like basically living skeletons, and showing pictures. And there's been cases of it being staged and that kind of thing. And there's an element of this. So in my book, I've actually called it statistical poverty porn.
Before we get to my full interview with Dr. STEVEN PAYSON, who challenges how the World Bank and the United Nations measures world poverty, extreme poverty, and in effect confuses and possibly misleads many people and damages the fight and campaign to tackle world poverty, extreme poverty in the world, it's time for our weekly segment of Future Shock 2.0 with the great workforce trends expert, Ira Wolfe, here talking to me about the latest concerns on artificial intelligence. Ira Wolfe, welcome back for Future Shock 2.0. Lots and lots of talk about artificial intelligence. We've talked about it in previous segments, but now there are ethical concerns, practical concerns that AI, if it's not checked, if there's not a pause, it could wreak havoc on humanity. Lots of bad stuff could happen. So how do you measure the risks versus benefits? Where is all this going on AI? Ira.
Hey, thanks, John, for having me back on Future Shock 2.0. That's a great topic, and everything you said is absolutely true. My tagline on LinkedIn is I'm fascinated and terrified by exponential change, by the future of work. And this certainly fits that category. So on the one hand, I'm an avid user of ChatGPT, which is the closest that I can get to AI on an everyday basis, or an advanced AI on an everyday basis. So I use it all the time. Lots of opportunities. I see that. Lots of growth. But there are legitimate concerns because there are no rails on it. There's no regulations. And that was the crux of the recent letter that was sent out by 800 leaders, very influential leaders, with that concern. The challenge is how, we can't get our regulators to agree on the most common things. And even when we do, they get challenged, rules that have been in place for 20 and 30 years. How do we get the people that need to put some guardrails in there, and not to stop it, but to put some legitimate guardrails in there to understand it? So there are legitimate concerns. I mean, one of them is a lot of information right now, and it certainly affects you as a journalist, all of it, anybody who creates content, is that there are no safeguards. I mean, there's no, what happens to intellectual property, that it's scanning any type of information that it uses. There's some built-in, especially living in the world of HR and future work, there's a lot of biases, racial and sexual biases that are built into that. For sure. It generates a lot of misinformation, which is a worldwide problem that we're being impacted by, and people don't seem to have the skill to scrutinize that, to differentiate between what's misinformation and the critical thinking skills to get that down. It also, and it's, even I feel I need to be careful with this, and sometimes we're in awe of the outputs that we get from it. We ask it a simple question and it comes up, but it really is giving the illusion of understanding. It gives the illusion of understanding, but it doesn't necessarily understand. And it's actually not very good in math, ironically, that we do this. But I just read this, and it might have been in one of the articles we shared with each other, that artificial general intelligence, which is the next level up. I mean, that's the scary part. The parts of like ChatGPT and things is not quite there yet. But it talked about what if AI, what if the technology can train itself on psychology and economics, then it also has access to our public information. Hopefully it doesn't have access to our private information. But if it knew who you and I are out there all the time, we're talking about our viewpoints and we're publishing them on LinkedIn and we do our podcast. So it knows our personal viewpoints and it can study psychology and economics. Could it communicate with us knowing who we are in a way to essentially bribe us or skew the answers? And I'm not the expert on this, but I would say yes, that we can get into a conversation with it, and it's going to be a heck of a lot smarter than we are at understanding it. It's going to understand us better, and so could it manipulate us? And then what's the guardrail on that? So, I mean, that's the really scary part. And so I agree with the letter that came out, with the concerns that it's terrifying. My challenge is I don't know how you put the toothpaste back in the tube with this. And I wish we can look toward Congress, regulators, government, or defer it to experts that could put a plan in place that is more objective, not biased. But I don't know how we get agreement on that. Obviously, you can take 1,000 of the greatest minds in the world and put them together and say, here's what the regulations could be. But if all the governments don't implement that, don't accept it, then, it's just hearsay. I mean, it's just a nice to have. But there's so many advantages that can come from that. I mean, I'm excited about the opportunity. Could it help us predict climate control? Not predict, but, solve climate control, some of the climate problems, financial poverty, cancer, medical. I mean, it's already found solutions and a lot of basically don't want to go into the politics of it, but the COVID vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine was through artificial intelligence. I mean, it was through technology that it was created. So there are fixes and there are many diseases that we have and chronic diseases that could be cured because of that. Again, clean water, clean air, that it's just going to be able to calculate, or find solutions and calculate that so much faster. But is there a danger? Yeah, absolutely.
We'll have more from Ira Wolf next week. Ira is a workforce trends expert, a top 5 global thought leader in his field, a TEDx talker and host of the popular Geeks, Geezers and Googleization podcast. Speaking of podcasts, listen also each week to the top-rated Odeon Capital Conversations podcast with bank analyst and top financial strategist Dick Bovee of Odeon Capital Group and Matt Van Alstyne, Odeon co-founder and managing partner, along with yours truly. The topics each week are money and markets, with lots lately from Dick Bovee on our banking crisis, the Federal Reserve, inflation, jobs, and much more. That's Odeon Capital Conversations up there on Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeart, and wherever you listen to your podcast. Odeon Capital Conversations is now a top-ranked Apple podcast in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Coming up next is my interview with Dr. STEVEN PAYSON, an economist at the Department of Labour who teaches at the University of Maryland, exposing, let's call it, fake economics as we grapple with the awfulness of extreme poverty across the globe. I'm your host, John Aidan Byrne.
We keep digging for the secrets and stories of uncommon and everyday things and interesting people.
Hi, I'm Danica Patrick. Watching my nieces grow, play, and learn is amazing, but not every child gets to be carefree. 1 in 6 kids in the U.S. are hungry. This breaks my heart, and it's something that Feeding America is working to change. Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and gives it to families in need. To help, visit feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
The poor will always be with us. We've heard that before. It's been a stark reality since the beginning of time. The numbers of people living in poverty in the world today and in extreme poverty is in the millions, in the billions, according to the World Bank. And for many people, the appropriate response is compassion, care, and many people also respond with their pocketbooks. It's all around us. We see it in the news. We read it in the papers every day. And how could we not be aware of poverty in the world? But it does raise an important question of how we measure that poverty so that we can respond appropriately with our resources and with our time and with our energy. One person who is now questioning the data that's coming out on the global statistics on poverty, which are published and widely used by many organizations. The information is published by the World Bank, and he is Dr. Steve Payson at the University of Maryland. And he's produced a number of volumes on this topic, and he raises a lot of questions on the statistics, which I find both fascinating and quite distressing. Dr. Payson, welcome to my show. Tell us about your book. You have some serious reservations about the data that has been published by the World Bank, which puts the level of global poverty at a very high level, and also something like 600 million or so residents of the globe are in extreme poverty by their measurement. But you question that. You don't think we should take that on face value.
Right. No, thanks. Thanks for having me. So there's a couple different ways to look at it. So one thing that I'm not saying, I just want to clarify, I'm not saying that we shouldn't worry or be concerned about the people in poverty, and the people in poverty do have very hard times. Okay. A lot of them are in big trouble and that kind of thing. So I just want to clarify that I'm not trying to downplay poverty itself. But what I found most disturbing about the World Bank statistics is that they measure the lowest levels of income in terms of US dollars. That's extremely low. So they have an extreme poverty line set at $2.15 now. And then they say that maybe 600 million, 700 million people in the world are living below that poverty line. That's getting per person per day, $2.15. And what I find is that number is very, very inaccurate and misleading in terms of what that actually means. Because if we, let's say, just talking about the United States as an example, if one of us is given $2.15 a day to live on, we would, even in the cheapest, most rural places, we would be starving and homeless. Okay. Now, if somebody says, oh, well, if you're getting that low, you'll get social assistance and things like that. That's true. And then, but then you wouldn't be getting $2.15 a day. You'd be getting much more, at least in kind, from all the different assistance you're getting. But if you're actually getting $2.15 a day, you would have nothing to eat hardly, even getting the cheapest food possible. You'd have no place to live because you couldn't afford rent anywhere, and that kind of thing. Now, in comparison, there are many people in developing countries that are said to be making something like $2 a day per person, and just by World Bank's own statistics, most of those people have smartphones. They live in a large proportion of them live in houses that have electricity and television. They're not homeless. They may go through periods of not getting enough food at various times. So I'm not trying to downplay that. And there's also a lot of vulnerability to things. So now some are homeless and starving, but it's not anything like the amount of people that you would think are that way because of the numbers. And the reason why we have this huge distortion is basically a wrinkle in the methodology to convert how much money they actually have and what they could actually buy with in terms of US dollar. Because if you took what they could buy from, if you took the $2.15 that we say they have, right, and on that poverty line, and you gave them the equivalent amount of money in their currency, they would be able to buy many, many more things with that actual money. So in other words, the $2.15 is way off. So I can keep going just as a little quick example. In one book by Banerjee and Duflo called Poor Economics, which is one of the most famous, books on development economics there is, and it's written by 2 Nobel laureates. Okay, in one little anecdote, they said that you can buy a dosa in a slum in India, a dosa being a kind of a breakfast food, maybe equivalent to, a bagel and cream cheese or something like that. And you can get it for 1 Indian rupee. And then they said the purchasing power parity of that rupee is 5 cents. In other words, they're saying that for 5 cents, you could buy breakfast. Okay. Now, to buy the same product in the United States might cost $5, not 5 cents. So somebody getting $2 a day, but, they would be able to buy 40 doses per day by that measure. So something is off of the measures of what people can truly afford. And so the $2.15 a day and the number of people living under it is really extremely deceptive in terms of what people can actually have, at the income levels that they have.
My guest is Dr. STEVEN PAYSON of the University of Maryland and an economist at the Department of Labour, talking to me here about his latest work on how the World Bank and the United Nations measures extreme poverty in the world and ends up confusing and likely misleading an awful lot of people. I'm your host, John Aidan Byrne. We should also remind our listeners and viewers that you are an economist at the Department of Labour, so you know how to crunch those numbers. The purchasing power parity, correct?
Yes.
Well, let's just give our listeners and viewers the numbers coming out of the World Bank, and I want to ask you, what's your estimates? I mean, what numbers do you have? What's the real numbers, if you will? The World Bank says that there are over 3 billion impoverished people in the world who are living on less than $6.85 per person per day. Among them, it says there are about 650 million people in extreme poverty who are living on less than that fabled $2.15. And a little few cents of that apparently can get you that wonderful breakfast in India. And also to reiterate, we're not downplaying the idea of poverty. It's distressing, it's heartbreaking. And for some people, the response is donation to charity. I'm big on that myself, and our family is. So nobody wants to see people go to bed at night hungry. But it's important to have a handle on the facts. So what's your estimate of how many people are in extreme poverty or are hungry in the world?
Yeah. So to be perfectly honest, I haven't done enough of the, sort of data collection and gathering. It would be a huge project for me to try to retranslate, how many people are, under what should truly be called $2.15. So what I did was I basically, in my book, I give various comparisons, okay, using different prices. So in other words, people can see what the purchasing power parity is that's on record that's being used. So let's say, a dollar buys, say 20 rupees or something like that in purchasing power parity. And then you take that number and you could go online. There's so much information now online. Find a grocery store in India and see what the prices are and what you could get for that same amount of money. Or, and I've done this several times, and I've seen that just this huge difference. So I can't really aggregate everything, because that would be an enormous task with different currencies and different things like that. And then if I said any aggregate number, of course, anybody can challenge that and say, oh, where'd you get that number? One thing, the World Bank has enormous resources, and they do a real lot to calculate purchasing power parities. But what they calculate are purchasing power parities on average for all purchases in a country. So, how much it would take to buy a car, or even take an international flight, or buy or have a meal in a luxury hotel or something like that. That's all inside the purchasing power parities they use. So, as I say, the devil is in the details. You're not comparing how much the lowest cost food would be in the country compared to, the United States or something like that. So, in other words, it's the difference in prices that they're not taking into account. And by the way, this error in not using the right prices is actually discussed in the economic literature. It's including a discussion by Angus Deaton, who's a Nobel laureate and former, president of the American Economic Association. And he even gave a presidential address to the American Economic Association, in which he mentions that this topic, not from the approach I'm taking, but just the topic of how do you measure, poverty with prices and things like that. And he said that this is missing in the analysis. So there's prominent economists who are kind of familiar with the whole problem. And I think it's basically being ignored, so that's where I'm coming. But I don't have any aggregate statistics that, I approach the topic to find out enough of what's wrong, but I, haven't.
But it leads us in a good direction, so we can get a real handle on the reality of all this poverty and extreme poverty, and what the World Bank is telling us and what we're supposed to believe and what may actually be the truth. I had a conversation recently with a tech worker out of Colombia, and he was working for a major electronics retailer in the United States. They had outsourced a lot of jobs to Colombia, and he was telling me what he earns. And initially I was saying, oh my gosh, how do you exist on that? But he was making the equivalent of $500 a month. And I said, can you live on $500 a month? He says, I'm living like a king here. I'm living like an absolute king. And I said, wow, interesting. And then he said, he told me that a good salary in Colombia was about $2,000 a month. Could live really well, upper middle class. So we have to be aware of those differences.
Yes, that's a major thing. I mean, take, for example, and I use this example in my book, how much does it cost to have a smartphone? Okay, now our smartphones in the United States may be better than ones in Africa, but the ones in Africa are smartphones. They can, you can see video on them. You can, you can do a lot. You can get into the internet. You can make payments on them with your bank. In other words, and make payments to people and everything else. Now, just as an example, they did a study, and they mentioned that 75% of all adults in the Gambia, which is a small African country, 75% of the adults have smartphones. Okay. Now, the average income, the mean income of the Gambia is estimated at about $2, maybe $2.50 per day. So there's, and there was another survey by the UN recently of, people living in the Gambia, and describing, how many households have electricity and, like I say, television in their house, things like that. So we're saying that so many people are supposedly getting $2 a day or maybe $3 a day. But if you added up their food, their shelter, their smartphones, their electricity, and you said, how much would it cost to have all those things if you live in the United States? It wouldn't be $2
Yeah,
a day. It would be, maybe, at least $20 a day or something.
absolutely.
So it depends on how you're counting it. Now, one other problem with the whole thing is if there's so much inaccuracy in in measuring what the lowest income people can afford, then you've got that inaccuracy in comparing different countries. So somebody in one country could be said to be getting $2 a day. In another country, they could be said to be getting $2 a day. But in the first country, they get a lot for those $2, and maybe we don't have to worry about them that much. Whereas the other country, they're getting very little for those $2 because we're not doing the homework of seeing what they're actually getting. So when you have that distortion, you're really losing your ability to help the people who are in most need. So in a way, it's a little bit of a self-defeating thing because, one of the reasons we can suspect that this is done this way is because it truly exaggerates, the plight of the poor. And the idea is that, by doing it this way, so many people think, oh, we really need more support, and help and donations. And that's, and so that's sort of like the motivation. But on the other hand, through this distortion, we don't have as good of an ability to find who really needs the help the most. So we're kind of self-defeated in a certain way. And another thing, I mean, there's a few different facets to the thing. Another thing that by exaggerating how little people have in in developing countries, you really don't have a sense of comparison to what the poorest people in industrialized countries have in comparison. Take slums in the United States or very, very low income areas where people have very, very little. You say, okay, these people, are on minimum wage or they're part-time on minimum wage. So they're very low income, let's say $5,000 a year. And then you say, oh, okay, well, $5,000 a year sounds really bad, but at least we have nothing to complain about compared to those people over there, developing countries who must be starving and homeless. If we actually compare things the right way with what kind of food people can eat and what kind of shelter they have and things like that, then our poor will look a lot closer to their poor. And that's, sort of another aspect of the whole thing, because once our poor start looking a lot closer to their poor, people might question helping their poor, assuming that they've got it so much worse than our poor, but our poor may also have it pretty bad.
Do you suspect an agenda by the World Bank that they're not doing it the way you think it should be done?
Well, I can't accuse people. I don't know what's in people's minds and in their hearts. I don't know what the agenda is. But all I can say is, there's a lot. This is one example of how a lot of times, and people have talked about this, poverty is exaggerated for the sake of attracting support and donations. And well-known economist, you probably heard of him, William Easterly, has made a big argument against what's called poverty porn. The idea, of showing horrible pictures, people in malnourished areas, people like basically living skeletons, and showing pictures. And there's been cases of it being staged and that kind of thing. And there's an element of this. So in my book, I've actually called it statistical poverty porn. Because also Easterly was talking about lyrics of songs that exaggerate the plight of poverty and that kind of thing. So it's not as, strong, I guess, as visual poverty porn, but it's the same, basic idea. But I can't accuse someone of deliberately doing something. The trouble is, with economics, and I've written about this in many different ways, there's a very much follow the leader kind of thing. Once a precedent is set and once a methodology is like said, this is our methodology, then, people assume it's the best methodology and there's not a good process for questioning it. And they try to make.
But surely the World Bank is aware of what you're presenting here, that it's not apples to apples. It doesn't take into account purchasing power parity. And, I'm kind of baffled in a way that they don't take that into account and present a clearer picture of poverty around the globe.
I'm also baffled by it. Now, I do reference this in my book, that they admit it in various ways. I mean, in their own literature, they explain that people have critiqued them on this issue. They're very vague about who's criticized them and that kind of thing. They're very vague about saying things like, well, people have criticized us on this, but other studies have shown that it doesn't make that much difference. And then I question those other studies to see how, whether they really, tested the right thing and that kind of thing. They haven't too much. But so there is a posture on their part to dismiss the issue. I don't know. I don't know how much is deliberate or just kind of like willful neglect of the problem. Real quick, one thing that might cause them to be reluctant is that it would be an enormous change. They would have to change their statistics dramatically and would have to admit then that they did it the wrong way. And that could be very hard for a huge organization that depends on so many donations and so much political support and that kind of thing.
Yeah, explain to us who the World Bank is. Who pulls the strings at the World Bank, and what is their mission? What is their work around the world?
First of all, I want to say that they're a very good organization. I mean, they're very in general. I mean, they get a lot of funding. The United States is one of their major contributors, so they are a bank, and they support a lot of development work around the world to give countries money for various projects to improve their infrastructure, to address health issues, to create, to develop plans to better employ their, people. And they're doing, all kinds of supporting wonderful projects around the world with their money. In general, I think the world is a much better place to have the World Bank than not to. Sometimes, it's kind of like if you're an engineer working for the World Bank or something like that, maybe you go to a country that doesn't have a good water supply and you help them, build, a well or something like that, or you're funded by them to do that, then you're really on the ground doing good work.
Yeah.
But, if you're involved in the economic statistics, you're kind of removed from the boots on the ground to help the poor.
It strikes me, and I'm sure this is what happens when donors and charitable organizations see the stats on Gambia or third world countries as calculated by the World Bank, and those numbers, the overall numbers, that influences the level of donations they're going to give and allocate. So in that sense, it does raise some issues. And then you raise the other matter of here in America, in some of the inner cities, not only are they war zones, but there's almost no infrastructure. It's been torn down, and there are kids actually going hungry at night. That could be as much to do with domestic strife and all kinds of social issues, as well as just lack of income.
Right. So yes, that's another factor, is where do the best, we should really find out what people's needs truly are in different parts of the world so we can best address them. But once we start playing around with the wrong purchasing power parities and the wrong translation of dollars, then we kind of mess everything up in terms of where we should have our priorities. One other aspect of this, which is also related a little bit to the poverty porn kind of idea, is that there's a bit of a dehumanizing aspect to like saying this country has a low, very low income, average of, let's say, $2.50. Okay. So basically, the people in this country are just kind of like in a different world. And you have these images of poverty porn where people are lying around with no food, no shelter, like refugees in a field. And when we have that impression of people in other countries that are like that, we have this kind of sense of superiority above them. And that interferes indirectly with many, many things like xenophobia, for example. It's like, those people who are used to getting $2 a day, we don't want them in our country because they must be so bad at being productive or something like that. It sort of feeds into this dehumanizing perspective, when in actuality, people are much more equal, in terms of their abilities, than these numbers.
It's really fascinating what you've come up with here. And of course, there are famines in the world. There are refugees. There are natural disasters, which thrusts individuals into poverty overnight. Again, the appropriate response for many of us is donations, charity, volunteer. I guess the World Bank and various charitable institutions on some levels and at some periods will get involved also. Anything in particular motivate you to write this book? Was it just grating on you that the World Bank had these stats that you felt were absolutely ridiculous?
Well, that was the main motivating factor. So, I've done a lot of work re-examining, what economists do and what it's fascinating to me what counts in terms of what's recognized as the most productive economic literature. What's the most what economics seems to get the most attention. And, I've seen a lot of sort of a show business kind of character in the field itself. And I teach, development economics at the University of Maryland. And one of the first major things when you teach economic development, no matter what textbook you use or that kind of thing, and not only economic development, just like economics in general, one of the most important things that they say at the beginning is, look how many poor people are in the world. And look what the World Bank has to tell you about, how many people are below this poverty line in the world. It's kind of like the first or second chapter to describe the situation, of the developing countries in the world. And so when you're presenting that as like the first major thing, when that this contradicts so many things, that you can easily see that did, disturb me. There are various other things, that I've written about, many other things actually, that are room for improvement in economic thought. And I think there's a lot of factors that cause problems in economics that just sort of stay there. It's kind of like you can't fix them for various sociological reasons in the profession. But this touched me also because I do care about the poorest people in the world. And it's kind of like this is maybe humanity's greatest problem. And, depending on how you look at it, but this is, up there. Yeah. And if we can't even decide to analyze this in an honest scientific way, then where are we?
Well, it occurred to me also, Doctor, that if they gave the purchasing power parity, if they introduced that concept and what $2 or more a day how far that would go in some of these countries, maybe actually in a kind of a strange way, donors would step up further because they say, oh, gee, I'm going to send $100 off this month. I'm going to take care of a lot of people. Whereas if the way it's presented to them right now is that, oh gosh, it's going to take multiple millions to move the poverty needle in some of these countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If because the dollar is very, very, very highly valued. So, once the dollar is translated to other countries, then that could buy so much more. But then that's the reason why purchasing power parity, numbers. So that would increase, definitely, I think where attention could go to give people the food and shelter who really need it. And another related aspect to this is that, developing countries, there's another demeaning aspect of it, that it's kind of like assuming this sort of paternalistic perspective. Developing countries have their own governments, their own economists, and the developing countries would like to say, to express when they are successful in growing their economies, to actually say, hey, you know what? We had people on this income, but we've improved things, and now they're at this higher income, and thanks to these industrialization policies that we've had, or educating, a large portion of the population, or the infrastructure developed. So we're kind of denying developing countries an ability to recognize their own progress, because they may, in truth, be able to provide enough food for their people, and everybody may have adequate nutrition, things like that. World Bank is still saying that they're living on $2 a day or $3 a day.
And then, of course, it's not part of your book, I'm sure, but we learn and hear about corruption and corrupt administrations in various countries around the globe which are suffering from famine, persecution, or whatever. The monies never get into the right hands. But that's probably a separate episode. I'm trying to also fully understand the concept of how a few dollars go so far in Gambia, for example. Is that related to the money supply, let's call it? Because if we look at America, the money supply has been growing exponentially, at least in recent years during the COVID pandemic, right through the 60s. And we've had all the inflationary spirals. So you're going to need a lot of dollars to buy your McDonald's or have a night in the hotel or go to Disney World versus some of these other countries. Any thoughts about that?
It's very complicated. There's so many factors in comparing dollars for different countries, and a part of that is because the products are very different, but there's one big aspect of this is the exchange rate, but the exchange rate is often based on other things besides purchasing power parity. So you've got, trade effects, going on, and just because people if they start to come upon money, they tend to want to buy dollars as a safe investment. So dollars tend to be overvalued relative to what you could actually buy for them. So it's a pretty complicated situation. Just as an example of how complicated it is, people in a lot of developing countries, they may have a shelter which protects them from, the weather and things like that. And in that shelter, they may have electricity and, that kind of thing. So they may, the kids may go to school, and then they come home from school and they're in the house, and there's a television there, and their parents might say, you have to finish your homework before you could watch television. And you get this sense that their life is not very different. Okay. But on the other hand, they may have their water source outside the house. They may not have indoor plumbing. Okay.
Yeah.
And they, have a latrine outside the house. Now, you can't rent any apartment or any house in the United States that doesn't have indoor plumbing. So what do? So there are many different ways in economics to address these kind of things. But basically, the World Bank's approach, or, there's a general approach, well, their housing is worth nothing, so we're going to give them nothing for that, and assume that their income is, for example, if you own a house in the United States, there's an income that could be attributed to you because you're effectively paying yourself rent, and then, get complicated that way. But, if you have, and it's the same thing with low quality food products. They may be low quality because they don't taste as good. Okay. But they may be providing the same kind of nutrition as some of our higher priced food that tastes delicious, but have no better nutrition. It's like I say, the devil's in the details, but there are ways to do it. There are ways to do it. It's not rocket science in that sense. You could attribute value to different things that they have compared to what we have in industrialized countries. It could be done, but it's just not done. It's just sort of outside the box. So therefore we're comparing things that essentially poor people can't buy, so in other words, if you're very low income in a developing country, you can't buy a car. That car might cost, that much more, in that country. But it's irrelevant,
To my earlier example of Colombia, the employee working in Colombia for a big major company said if you had $250,000, you could live in the equivalent of a house that you would buy in Hollywood, the boulevard there in Hollywood where all the stars hang out. Just would be a colossal, beautiful mansion with swimming pool, servants, manicure, garden, just nirvana, paradise. So just to be clear, the World Bank presents its data in US dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
For countries' income. So you can have just so we can have a meaningful measure of contrasting, but
US dollars.
It's not done right. It's US dollars, but it's not what would cost US dollars in the United States for the same thing.
Yeah, of course. And then the other thing was, well, two things really, and I'll ask you the first one. The US dollar is the reserve currency. I think 60% of the trade and commerce in the world is done with the exchange of US dollars, which explains its preeminence, as it were. So that probably partly explains some of these really weird distortions. But the other question was that we came up with this classification, I believe back in the 60s or whatever, maybe at a UN conference, of calling a lot of countries in the global south and Africa third world countries. And you're in development economics. And what's your thoughts about that, number one? And should any of those countries, should more countries be lifted from the ranks of the third world into the developed or the first world? Where are we going?
Yeah. So third world is more of a, sort of common term used by the public. So the World Bank and, IMF and, the major economic institutions, they follow generally the World Bank's classification. So the major classification that's used is what's called low income countries. So there's the low income countries have the lowest per capita income. Then there's kind of middle income countries. Sometimes there's things in between. There's a list of low middle income countries and that kind of thing. I think the idea of the classification could be useful. Okay. But again, we need to do much better homework to see what really translates into what people, have. Because the GDP per capita is what's used to define these. But again, a lot of things are lost in translation in terms of what people can really buy. Now, the thing is with, if it's measured incorrectly, consistently through countries, the countries with the lowest income will still be the countries with the lowest income. In other words, if we're off by a factor of 2, you will multiply everybody's income, they're still the lowest are in the end. Well, I worry about the real differences that can truly exist, because maybe one is in that group, in the lowest group, that doesn't belong there, just has a real lousy exchange rate or something like that causing that, or, something like that. And the other ones could be higher up that need to be, lower ranked and that kind of thing.
I have seen images from Africa, some of these big cities there. Residents are walking around on Main Street. They have their cell phones. They're going into beautiful shopping malls. They're dining out in beautiful restaurants. And it has all the appearances of glamour and wealth. And of course, that's not to dismiss the notion that there are people living in poverty in those cities and in those countries, as they are here in the United States. And, it'll never go away. The name of your book is Extreme Poverty in the World, How the World Bank and United Nations Measure It. Fake Economics Exposed, its Pervasiveness, Harmfulness and Prevention. It's out on paperback and you can get it on Amazon. And it's a series of books you've done, right, on this whole theme.
It's a series of books I've done on the theme of the way economics can be improved. Mm-hmm. So there's another book that I did, or it's an earlier series that relates to poverty. And it also has some similarities, the idea that we're addressing poverty the right way when there's a lot of questions about that. So one of the other practices in addressing poverty is the randomized controlled trials, which is another issue, and whether or not that's getting the the recognition that it deserves. It's getting a lot of positive recognition, but that's very questionable. A lot of people question that. So that's another thing on poverty that I've worked on. But I've worked on a lot of other areas that have to do with just in general how economists do research and how sometimes they can get away with things that are not right. and when they do, they could have major implications. So it's an investigation really in how economists can better sort of police themselves and the better, have a stronger sense of scientific objectivity.
You're not suggesting, and I'm not certainly supporting the idea of people withholding their donations from really good charities, because there's a lot of really good charities, but you're providing some clarity on the data, which is critical also.
Yes, thanks. Yes, and I also agree that we should keep supporting, third world countries or low income countries because they really need it. A lot of good is being done with that donation money.
Yeah,
it's just it could be analyzed. The situations should be analyzed better, and when we analyze it better, we can see where the money could be put even more efficiently.
And that's why people should read your book.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Payson, thank you for being my guest.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You were listening to Dig Life Deep with John Aidan Byrne. You can reach the host in the U.S. at 973-529-4699. That's 973-529-4699. 973-529-4699. Email byrnedesk@gmail.com. That's byrnedesk, BYRNE, desk@gmail.com. byrnedesk@gmail.com. Subscribe for free.